All right. Well, today we've got a great guest, a gentleman running for Congress. He once before in Virginia ran for U.S. Senate. Now he's running for Congress in a very good district. It's a +6 Republican district. She's running against Abigail Spanberger, who is one of those pretend moderate Democrats who votes 90% or so with Nancy Pelosi, and so what we're going to do here is we're going to ask you a couple questions about what kind of congressman you're going to be. Mm-hmm. Right, assuming you win, we want you to win. What kind of congressman are you going to be? What you're going to vote for, so that our donors who take good hard-earned money out of their pocket to support our PAC knows that it's going to the right people, and they can also donate to you directly as well. And we want to know how the campaign's going, how the fundraising's going, and what you think the chances are in terms of your race here. And I want to start out by just introducing yourself. I want to hear
Sure.
about you.
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity. Well, first things first, I'm married. My wife and I have been married for 21 years. Got married right out of high school. We have 3 kids, Lily, Luke, and Allie. I enlisted in the military right out of high school, served with the 82nd Airborne Division and the 25th Infantry as an infantryman, and then volunteered for Army Special Forces, did a couple of tours over in Iraq as a Green Beret. And then when I got back to Virginia, I started getting more involved in kind of grassroots level activism and was asked to run for the Virginia House of Delegates. And that's where I've been serving for the last 5 years. I've also done a lot of work with Young Americans for Liberty. It's an organization I care a great deal about. I've done a lot of work with them, not just in Virginia, but in other areas of the country as well. My whole political philosophy is really rooted in the idea that government's primary function is to protect individual liberty, protect property rights, and otherwise leave you free to live your life the way you want. In fact, one of the reasons why I got involved into politics in the first place was certainly not because I wanted to be necessarily in elected office, but I was tired of this paradigm within modern political discourse in the United States that was, well, which political party is going to run my life for the next 2 to 4 years? And I really think that's not the direction that we should be going. I think it's antithetical to what the American experiment is all about. And so my voting record in the last 5 years will reflect that I really do believe that while there are certain legitimate functions of government, that they are actually very, very limited, especially on the federal level. When you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, what is the federal government supposed to be doing versus what is it currently doing? And I think right now it constantly interferes into those things that are the province of the individual, the family, the church, civic organizations. And I think it's really rooted in the idea of how do you see people? And I see people as having inherent worth. And I think that they have a right to live their life and pursue happiness in accordance with their definition of it, not the government's definition of it. And when you have that as your starting point, it affects the way you look at legislation. And so I have become convinced, both from my experience before politics and certainly in politics, that free people working in voluntary cooperation are far more effective at solving problems and rising to challenges than government bureaucracy is. And so that's what informs my overall approach to politics.
I appreciate that, and thank you for your service. You spent 11 years in the military, you said, right?
That's correct.
That's incredible service, and a Green Beret. You're a tough guy.
Well, used to be at least.
I've worked with some special forces gentlemen, veterans, and in a group called Special Operations Speaks, and they were all Vietnam era special operations, and they are the toughest, toughest human beings I've ever met in my life. Sometimes scary. Sometimes scary. So I definitely appreciate your service. And now, and knowing a little bit about your background, I became familiar with you when you gave this tremendous speech on the floor of the Virginia delegates, right? On gun rights, and I became a fan immediately. I would say I would put you, if there was a Liberty Republican, an establishment Republican, or a neocon Republican, I would probably say you're in the Liberty side. Am I right on that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
You're endorsed by Rand Paul and Young Americans for Liberty. That is definitely more of a libertarian side of the party. And so my first couple questions are going to be, on these particular issues that are important. I'm a libertarian Republican myself, little L libertarian Republican, so because we back all 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all very important to us. The issue today, of course, has been in what's going on with defund the police, what's going on with the riots and everything else, and as a liberal Republican, I've had issues in the past with, especially during the Obama administration, with violations of the Fourth Amendment. And that some police powers need to be reined in. I believe that. But how do you feel about what's going on today with the defund movement? And how would you correct this situation as a member of Congress?
I don't think the defund movement is the right way to go about this at all. I think what we need is more community-based policing. And what's interesting is if you look at what Eleanor Ostrom wrote about this, she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Economics. And when she did her field work on the police consolidation movement, which was a movement that started in the 20s and really got moving in a lot of ways in the 1970s, is when it really started to take effect. You had a lot of smaller departments getting consolidated into larger ones. And I think from an economic standpoint, we understand the trying to use resources. And there's certainly certain aspects of law enforcement, forensics and things like that, where you can consolidate and make them available for make them available for more departments. But we really lost something in the community-based approach to law enforcement. The most effective law enforcement is the one that is really tied in with the people that it's actually serving. And it's actually a collaborative process, not only between lawmakers and law enforcement, but also the citizens as well, as far as determining what the priorities should look like for that police department. And when you have that sort of a positive relationship, when you have people that see their police department as being of the community as opposed to outside the community, you get far better results. I think the other things that we have to be honest about, men and women in law enforcement live at the business end of every stupid idea a politician ever passes into law. And I think it's important for politicians to not only look at reforming law enforcement, but also look at reforming themselves. There was a speech I gave on the House of Delegates where I had to remind my colleagues that everything that we pass through this House comes with the threat of violence. And just because you think something is a good idea, or if you think it's such a good idea, why does it require coercion in order to implement? And so I think if we do more things like what Chip Roy is trying to do on the Count the Crimes bill that we see, we're actually identifying all the different ways that the federal government creates different fines, fees, penalties, crimes, and determining which ones are truly appropriate, which ones are there that are actually affecting what I like to call involuntary human interaction. Obviously, there's an appropriate role for law enforcement when we're talking about somebody that is hurting another person, stealing from another person, defrauding another person. But we have a lot of other laws on the books that I think fall outside of what I think is a sound criminal justice approach. So I do support law enforcement reform and getting back to more community-based policing. I've carried criminal justice reform legislation. I carried the civil asset forfeiture reform for 3 years in the Virginia General Assembly and was able to get good bipartisan support for that legislation, and we eventually got it passed. So I think that's the appropriate role when we're looking at police reform or criminal justice reform. But what we're seeing right now, when people are essentially resorting to violence in order to achieve a political objective, I think that's antithetical to what we mean when we're talking about First Amendment rights. And there's a few different reasons why I'm definitely opposed to this sort of rioting and looting that we're seeing. One is that obviously it's the use of violence. Two, it's a clear violation of other people's private property rights. But the other thing, too, that I think is detrimental about it is that when you do have people that are engaging in a peaceful protest, and then you have other people that come in order to try to hijack the peaceful protest in order to turn it in to something else, or resorting to violence in order to achieve an objective, which sometimes is very different from the reason why the protest took place in the first place. I mean, you're now they're actually doing violence or they're doing damage to the people that are trying to exercise their First Amendment rights. And so while I do think that has to be cracked down on, and obviously everybody's entitled to due process of law, I do think allowing violence to go unpunished like that is, again, antithetical to what the First Amendment is supposed to protect.
Look, that would a perfect answer. I mean, that especially I didn't know you were carrying the civil asset forfeiture, which is a real problem in a lot of states, and I'm glad you were able to carry that. Now, again, I mentioned I heard your speech on the Second Amendment. It was a great speech, and the Second Amendment is something that is extraordinarily important. We hosted a Gun Appreciation Day in 2013. Turned out 500,000 people after the Newtown killing. It was we turned the conversation from gun control to gun rights when nobody was willing to have that conversation. So what you did on the floor was incredible. However, in Virginia, we keep losing. We keep losing more and more rights. In terms of our Second Amendment. What can you do as a member of Congress to protect the Second Amendment?
I think there's a couple of things. Obviously, from a legislative perspective, we want to ensure that we're protecting the true meaning of the Second Amendment, which is the government recognizing two things. If you look at the way the Second Amendment is written, it's pretty interesting. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The second part of the Second Amendment is the government recognizing that your right to defend yourself is a pre-existing right. It's not a privilege granted to you by government. It is a pre-existing right. Now, a lot of times when this conversation is talked about, especially in political circles, people want to just talk about the first part in a well-regulated militia, and they completely misunderstand why the founders put that in there in the first place. They didn't put a well-regulated militia in there, or they didn't put the part about a well-regulated militia in there in order to suggest that you had to be a member of the militia in order to keep and bear arms. They talked about the militia because they recognized that your right to keep and bear arms was essential in order to be able to have a militia, and having a militia was essential in order to be able to protect a free state. So there's actually two interests that the government has with respect to your individual right to carry firearms. One is your inherent right to defend yourself. The other is the only way a free country remains free is if free people are able to defend it. And so I think it's very important for us to understand at a fundamental level why the Second Amendment is there. I think when it comes to this issue as well as many other issues, if you're a liberty person, we need to do a better job of actually articulating what it is that we believe in. I mean, you saw the amount of young people that were interested in politics or became interested in politics because of Dr. Ron Paul, and that's largely been continued through Dr. Rand Paul, through Young Americans for Liberty and other organizations. When we talk about not just the economic benefits of liberty, but when we actually talk about the moral benefits, when we talk about it from a system of actually being able to achieve genuine justice, I think that's very important because, again, if we want to defend rights, the argument that we're engaging in right now can't just be about, again, the economic benefits of it. There's economic benefits to it because there are moral and justice benefits to it. And when each human being has a right to be able to pursue happiness, when they have a right to be able to go into the occupational field that they want, get the education they want, when they have a right to go onto the marketplace and work with other people to exchange ideas and goods and services, that not only produces good economic results, it actually produces a just society. And when we argue about it on those terms, I think we get a lot farther, especially with younger generations right now, that they've only heard a caricature of one side of the argument, and then they've heard, I would argue, a caricature of the side that they're adopting, because anybody that looks at the track record of socialism or communism or any sort of authoritarian system of government will see that it produces horrible results. And it produces horrible results inevitably because it teaches people to believe that they're so much less than what they are, that people are essentially just waiting around for some wise government agency or politician to tell them what to do next, when in reality, they have their own dreams, hopes, passions, ambitions, and they should be free to pursue those. And insofar as they're able to do so in voluntary cooperation with others, it benefits not only them, it benefits their community, and it achieves the sort of justice, prosperity, and security that I think we all want.
Again, is spot on, and it is that pesky comma in the Second Amendment that the liberals would wish, if they could just erase one thing, it would be that comma in the Second Amendment that says because. Really, what they're saying is because the state needs a militia. That's why we need. That's why our rights to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Well, I think that another thing too, when we talk about the Second Amendment, we need to also make sure that people understand that there's another component to this. And one of the things that I typically highlight when I talk about the Second Amendment is all of the people that were not victims as a result of being able to have the means to defend themselves. And when we talk about the Second Amendment, again, I was a Green Beret. The government spent a lot of money teaching me how to fight, how to defend myself. But the Second Amendment is a great equalizer for someone that isn't as physically strong, isn't as fast, can be easily overpowered. The Second Amendment empowers them to be able to live their life, to be able to go about their business, to be able to defend their family against someone that they would never win in a physical fight against. And I think it's important for us to show how the Second Amendment makes someone that would otherwise be vulnerable able to defend themselves and their families.
You're absolutely right. Look, I think the numbers, 40% of the 40 or 50% of the new guns that were sold in 2020 were sold to women. And that's, not that women can't defend themselves, but, women as a gender are typically not going to be able to stand up to a 200-pound muscle-bound guy. And so it is the great equalizer. It is the kind of thing that is important. And I've got, a wife and a daughter, and knowing that my wife knows how to handle a gun is very reassuring, and my daughter will know how to handle a gun. That's for sure. So the going back to the police issue, you have an interesting perspective because you've been in the legislature in Virginia. Virginia's trying to downgrade, or they have downgraded the assault on a police officer to a misdemeanor. How do you feel about that?
I don't think it was the right approach. I think it sends the wrong message. Again, if we're talking about genuine police reform, then I think it's how do we get back to better community policing? And obviously, I think there was room for reform on things like qualified immunity. I think Justice Clarence Thomas made a good case on how it can be effectively reformed. Same thing with things like no-knock warrants. Yes, there may be some areas where a no-knock warrant is necessary, but it's probably a lot more limited than what it's currently being used for. So I think there's a lot of areas where we should be able to come to common cause and common agreement on this. But when we're creating a situation where now you see law enforcement officers being deliberately targeted because there's been this drumbeat, this narrative saying that, well, the country is systematically racist. And you see this from different organizations. You see it from the 1619 Project. And I think it's a fundamentally flawed way to view the American founding and to view our justice system. I mean, obviously, there were times in this country's history where we did have very clear, defined instances of systematic racism within the code. You see that within Jim Crow laws. And I think anytime we can keep the conversation on, okay, show us within the code, show us within the institutions what you're talking about, and then let's have a rational discussion about how we remove elements like that. I think that makes a lot of sense. But more and more, you've seen the conversation shift in such a way to where when they can't produce evidence, they say the lack of evidence is evidence of a conspiracy. Well, again, I don't know where to go with that. And we're now creating, I think, a fundamentally flawed narrative by suggesting that if you don't believe that the country is irredeemably racist or that people are irredeemably racist, well, then now all of a sudden you're part of the problem, or that's just evidence of racism. Again, I think the more we talk about protecting civil liberties, the more we talk about due process of law, equality before our justice system, that's where the conversation needs to be, because that actually points us in a positive direction that I think we all want to move toward. But unfortunately, in a lot of cases, certain accusations don't require evidence anymore. They're just bludgeons. And if you don't do what they want you to do, or if you don't agree with their policy, well, then they're going to accuse you of these things. And that's not a way to engage in civil dialogue or debate. It's a way to shut down debate and essentially intimidate people into your way of thinking, which, again, I think goes completely against what the conversation should be with respect to law enforcement reform, criminal justice reform, or really any sort of policy decision that we're discussing.
I appreciate that answer. And look, I'm going to put a question together that has three parts, but they're all kind of related. We got this COVID pandemic, and Virginia's schools are mostly shut down. Everyone's doing just this distance learning stuff, and forcing kids to learn on a computer for hours a day instead of going into class and interacting. So how do you feel about schools reopening? How do you feel about the mask mandates and the lockdowns that have killed businesses in Virginia?
Sure. So I think with education, my biggest problem with education is the government's attempt to monopolize the process. If we really want an education system that's going to work for all of our students, then we need something where I would say at the very least dollars following the students so that we can actually have a marketplace of ideas. Because if you want an education system that's going to actually serve the students, then it needs to be every bit as diverse as the student body it's attempting to serve. And I don't think you can do that with government bureaucracies and politicians running the show. I think it has to be informed decisions being made by parents and teachers. And with dollars following students, I think you get a far more diverse marketplace of ideas in order to make sure that our education system is working for a diverse student body and preparing them to be able to enter into society in general and certainly into the workforce. So I would say my biggest issue is, it's not just about the school shutdowns. It's about government control. I want parents and teachers to have far more control over our education than politicians. And I think, unfortunately, we've come to a point when we talk about education, anytime you talk about any sort of substantive reform that would give the actual customers of education more choice, you're automatically accused of being against public education. And I think the real problem is that, well, are you... when they talk about public education, are they talking about public education or are they talking about educating the public? Of course, I want the public to be educated. I just think that they would be far better at determining what sort of educational opportunities would be more conducive to their goals, not the government's objectives. And that's why you see so many problems with too much emphasis on standardized testing. It's why you see problems with emphasis on sending a child to a four-year university that might not really have a great deal of desire or might not fit in with what their ultimate career and life goals are. And so the more of a marketplace for education that we can create, the better off that we would be. And I think that we could say that's especially true when we're talking about something like a healthcare crisis or a pandemic, where now all of a sudden there's concerns outside of just not only achieving the best education, but doing so in a way that's healthy and safe and responsible. Imagine if we were in a situation right now where teachers had the ability to set up different tutoring opportunities or working together in smaller co-ops. That would all be possible if we actually had dollars following students. But unfortunately, we have bureaucrats running the show right now, and they've determined that you're either going to learn online or you're going to go into a classroom. And in the meantime, the actual consumers of education have very little, if any, say over what their education looks like. So I think we have to address the bigger issue here. And if we're smart about this, what's going on right now during the pandemic, it really highlights some of the problems that we have in a government monopolized system and should key us into talking about the ways that we can improve it, not only for what's going on right now, but in the future as well. And then with respect to mask mandates and the shutdowns, again, this is once again an excellent opportunity to talk about the differences in approaches to solving problems. I know my opponent loves to talk about, she just wants to solve problems. It's like, okay, well, that might be true, but her solution to every problem is more government power and control. And my solution to problems typically runs along the lines of, well, what if we gave individuals more control over their life? I think they would probably come up with better solutions to their problems than, a room full of bureaucrats could. So, with the mask mandates, again, I don't think it's the role of government to mandate masks. I certainly don't think it's the role of government to ultimately shut down the economy. I think it's fascinating the same politicians that want to dole out all this money don't seem to understand that at the very least, they should be able to get that you can't tax what you haven't allowed someone else to earn. And right now we're running into a huge problem where the quote unquote solution to COVID is in many cases turning out to be worse than COVID itself. And COVID is bad enough on its own without politicians making it worse through government shutdowns. It's like anything else. When we look at the government response to COVID on so many levels, especially at the state level in some areas like New York and here in Virginia, their response was nowhere near as effective as the private sector's response, whether it was providing small business loans in order to keep companies open, whether it was shifting manufacturing over to healthcare products that were desperately needed in the midst of the pandemic. The private sector was far more responsive, far more quick and adaptable than government programs were. And I hope we learned the correct lesson for this, which is, once again, it's not to say that the government has no role to play, but this idea, these draconian shutdowns, which have hurt us not only from an economic standpoint, they've hurt us from a healthcare standpoint. And you see this especially in places like New York, where they were forcing people back into nursing homes where people were incredibly susceptible to the virus. So I think going forward, again, the government does have a role to play when it comes to maybe allocation of government resources as necessary to hotspots in order to make sure that our medical system doesn't get overwhelmed. But earlier on, we had a much more honest view of this, which was flatten the curve. And that comes from an understanding that anytime you're dealing with a pandemic, which is highly contagious, you're going to have a spike initially. People tend to adjust behavior appropriately as a result of the spike. You deploy additional resources to make sure that you can flatten the curve and don't overwhelm your medical systems, especially in high threat areas. And then generally it starts to go down, and then you're going to have another spike at some point inevitably, because as people get more comfortable or they see more things happening where they have to get back to their daily lives. They have to continue to work. You can't shut down forever. And so you see another spike. But the goal should always be flatten the curve. And while government does have some role to play in it, it's also about allowing the private sector to adapt appropriately in order to get resources where they need to be, in order to make sure that people, especially vulnerable populations, can have access to those resources and services in order to be able to weather the storm. And then eventually, with things like medical developments, herd immunity, you're able to get back to a certain degree of normalcy.
Two more questions, and I want to ask you about the campaign itself.
Sure.
First one being, and this is one of the most important votes a member of Congress can make, is whether or not to send our men and women to war. And so that's a very important vote. So I want to know what cases would you say in the last couple of decades would you have voted for Vietnam? Would you have voted for the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, knowing what you know now? And two, Trump just had what many people think is a historic moment. I believe so as well. How do you feel about his foreign policy and his approach to peace, which has been different than every other administration in modern times?
Sure. So having served 2 tours in Iraq, and I'm very proud of my service. I'm proud of the service that my fellow servicemen and women provided, because, again, it's not the United States military that dictates foreign policy. It's the United States military that essentially lives on the business end of U.S. foreign policy. One of the things that's very frustrating to me about how Congress has conducted themselves, I would argue probably ever since the War Powers Act, is this idea where they essentially abdicate responsibility that they have to actually declare war if you're going to get involved in a major engagement. Obviously, there's times where the president, I believe, has authority to be able to defend the United States against imminent attacks, or to be able to strike if necessary in order to prevent such an attack that has been verified. But ultimately, when we're going to get into a major involvement, such as Vietnam, such as Iraq, such as Afghanistan, that really should have required a declaration of war. And the fact that Congress has been all too happy to abdicate its responsibility to the executive branch demonstrates to me that they're not willing to expend an ounce of the courage that they expect out of our men and women in uniform. And so I've actually been very impressed with the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy as a combination of bringing troops home from Afghanistan. One of the other things, too, that I don't think has been spoken enough about is when the Iranian government actually shot down a piece of equipment the United States had, we didn't sustain casualties, and he was offered a strike or response to that. And he actually refused to do it because he believed that there would be too much collateral damage, and that ultimately we would create more enemies than we would actually harm in the process. And I thought that was a very insightful way to look at a lot of the conflicts and the response the United States has taken toward threats or attacks on the U.S. By the same token, when someone attacked U.S. soil, because a U.S. embassy is U.S. soil, he responded, and he responded very surgically, and he responded towards someone that was directly responsible for actually fostering and supporting the attack. And I think that's one of the things that's important to understand, is that far too often we get into this U.S. foreign policy where the United States is the world's police force. I think innocent people end up getting hurt as a result of collateral damage. And if you look at a lot of these dictators, they don't care if their people get hurt, but they certainly care if they get hurt. And I think it's important that we should always attempt to protect innocent human life and in those times where we do have to respond to a threat. But when it comes to deploying troops to combat, Congress needs to vote on a declaration of war. When it comes to what is a justified use of U.S. military forces, I think there has to be a clear and present danger to U.S. national security. And I would interpret that probably far more conservatively than, unfortunately, a lot of Democrats or Republicans have in the past. I really think that if we want positive engagement with people across the world, we should be engaging more in trade. I think, Frederick Bastiat said it best: if you don't allow goods to cross borders, troops will. And so I think the more cultural engagement, the more economic engagement we can have with other countries, the better off that we're going to be, not only from an economic standpoint, but also from a foreign policy standpoint. Having said that, I do want the best trained, best equipped, most effective military in the world. And should it have to be used, I want it to be used effectively with a clear objective in mind. I want a clear idea of what victory looks like, and that our troops should go over there, get the job done, and be able to come home as quickly as possible.
Exactly what should happen. And so I'm assuming you would not vote for a renewal of the Patriot Act.
No, I would not. I would not vote for a renewal of the Patriot Act, nor would I vote for a renewal of FISA without significant reform.
Now, you've raised, according to the FEC, at the end of June, over $1 million in your race. Your opponents raised about $5 million. And just so the audience knows, when you're an incumbent, people throw money at you. You don't have to do anything. It's not even fundraising. They just open the mailbox and checks are in there. So when you say a challenger is raising 1/5 of the money, you say, oh, he doesn't have a shot. Raising $1 million is hard, and we actually want to support you in helping you raise money. We're going to write you a check, and we hope that our donors and our supporters also write you checks and donate directly to your campaign. But it is a big difference. She's got $5 million, you got $1 million. How do you plan to combat that difference?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things, too, that we have to understand is that there tends to be some fundamental differences between the way Democrats raise money through Act Blue and other organizations and the way Republicans run money. And a lot of Republican donors behave very differently than Democrat donors. Democrat donors tend to prefer giving directly to candidates or giving to organizations which then give directly to candidates. A lot of Republican donors, some of them like to give directly to the candidate, but some of them also like to give through organizations that go through a vetting process, so they know that when their money is being spent, it is being spent to help a candidate that reflects their values and candidates that have a real shot at winning. And so when you actually look at the totals raised for this race, so that's what the individual candidates have raised, and that's what outside groups are spending on the race. You get a very different picture of what's going on in the Virginia 7th District. Right now, between what she has raised directly and between what outside groups are doing for her campaign, she's probably somewhere at about $7 million. If you look at what we have raised plus what outside groups have already done for our campaign or doing through the airwaves or on the ground game, we're probably at around $6.3 million. So that paints a very, very different picture of where the race is, and I think it paints a much more accurate picture of where the race is. And so we're very grateful to the conservative organizations like Conservative Leadership Fund, Club for Growth, and others that have come on board and have supported our campaign through mail, supported our campaign through the airwaves, through TV ads. And so I would want people to understand that we are very competitive with Abigail Spanberger when it comes to the fundraising component. We're very close to meeting our goal here in September, which if we do, will be probably the most money that a Republican House candidate has ever raised in Virginia. And we need it because in order to effectively campaign against an incumbent that's getting money from Nancy Pelosi and everywhere else, we have to spend between $150,000 to $200,000 a week between our ground game operations, our TV ads, direct mail, all of those different efforts. And so far, I'm very proud with our results because when we first won the nomination in mid-July, we were down by about 4 points. We've already jumped up 4 points in the polls, and that's after the Democrat Campaign Congressional Committee moved up all of their attack ads on us by 2 weeks. And so they know they're in trouble in this district. They know that our overall fundraising numbers and support are far better than what they were expecting and far closer to them than they ever anticipated. And so we are in a great position right now. We can win the race. The only question at this point is, will we be able to keep doing what we're doing? The same strategy that gained us 4 points in a couple of weeks, the same strategy that is going to allow us to win by 4 to 5 points on election night. We have to be able to execute that strategy all the way through November 3rd. And that's why support from your organization and financial support from those donors is so critical.
And it is. It's a very very tough slug. I mean, they are pouring money into your district, so we're going to win. You're going to win. I believe the Republicans are going to win. I believe Trump is going to win. Now we have the House back. Who are you voting for Speaker?
So I promised right off the bat that I would not commit to a Speaker candidate at this point. And the reason why is important is because I don't know who the candidates would be. I certainly know who my preferences would be. And I have really good working relationships with people like Ben Klein and Mark Green and Jim Jordan and others. But again, just like I promised in my House of Delegates race in the State House that I wasn't going to promise to vote for a particular Speaker candidate, I will see who the Speaker candidates are. And then I will vote with the one that I think is closest within my ideology and that can help lead us to a genuine liberty-focused agenda for the Republican House caucus. So that's what I'm committed to at this point.
One other question about the campaign: how are you reaching out to voters? Do you have a ground game? Are you pressing the flesh, or is it digital and TV?
No, it's all of the above. In fact, what's interesting is our opponent is not knocking on any doors this election cycle, which I think is probably, one of the biggest indicators that they simply don't understand the nature of this race. Door knocking is one of the most effective methods of campaigning. And by the time we're done, we will have knocked on over 200,000 doors, and her campaign will have knocked on 0. In addition to that, obviously, we have our TV ads up, both on cable and network television. There's radio ads that will be going out. There's direct mail that's going out. We've been doing a lot of work on social media as well. I'm in a unique position that because of some of the work that I've done within the General Assembly, because of some of the debates that I've been involved in, I actually have twice the social media presence that Abigail Spanberger does, which is very unusual for a challenger to an incumbent congresswoman. And so we've been able to utilize that. We do a Facebook Live town hall every Tuesday at 8 p.m. We have an average of 15,000 views every time we do it. We've had as high as 40,000. We also do a podcast where we talk specifically about policy. So we've used the conditions that are going right now to our advantage to be able to really push through our social media and our digital presence. But at the same time, we're not ignoring what's going on the ground. And here's what's one of the most fascinating things. In a typical election year, you would be happy with about a 20% take rate at the door. And that's just to say that for every 10 doors you knock, 2 people are willing to actually talk with you, answer your questions. We're actually experiencing as high as a 40% take rate because people are at home. And as long as you're responsible of boundaries and you're door knocking in a responsible way, you've got your PPE on you, people are actually very happy for the conversation and the opportunity to talk with someone about what's going on in the country. So I think our door knocking has been significantly more effective than it typically would have been. And it's always one of the most effective methods of campaigning. So we're still doing a full court press. We go to events. Again, we're always respectful of the boundaries that venues have or that people attending the event have, but we're doing events, we're doing door knocking, we're doing the airwaves, and we're doing TV, and I think we're going to be successful, provided that we can keep up the pace that we're currently maintaining through November 3rd.
Well, look, I appreciate you coming and spending some time answering some questions. If you're a Liberty Republican, this is your prototypical candidate. We need to have Nick Freitas in Congress, and so I urge you to take out your credit card, your checkbook, and donate to Nick at his website, which you can tell us your website if you don't mind.
Sure, it's nick4va.com. That's nickforva.com. And you can also find access there to, again, our weekly town halls and to our podcast, too, which is called Making the Argument with Nick Freitas, where we go into specific detail about the policies we support and how we would go about implementing them in Congress.
And you could also, if you'd like, you can go to Constitutional Rights PAC and contribute through our PAC. 100% of the contributions, Nick, that come in for you will go to you. We'll even pay the credit card fee. So we'll even get, if you pay on the credit card, 98% would go to the candidate. 100% is going to go to the candidate if you donate through Constitutional Rights PAC. I thank you for coming, and please, if you're watching this video, share it. Share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter. They'll probably block it because they're terrible. Most importantly, share it on Parler because that's a social media app that doesn't censor you. So I appreciate the time and thank you for your answers, your candidness, and your willingness to come on camera and tell everybody what your issues are and where you stand.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Constitutional Rights PAC is responsible for the content of this message.